Thanks everyone for joining us for the September 17th forecast discussion. We've got Sheann with us today, our industry participant from Statara Capital. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that close to being right. In terms of today's agenda, I think we're gonna follow what we tried last time in terms of doing a little bit of an attribution study first. This might be a little bit new to you since you haven't been with us in maybe over a month, but we're going to just try to look back at past performance attribution for the first maybe 10 whatever minutes, 15 minutes of the meeting, and then we'll get into our usual process where we'll talk about today's forecast, and we'll go around and give our 2-minute briefings, and then dive into any major topics of the day. Before we get going, does anyone just want to highlight any other, I don't know, important items that you want to make sure we discuss today? Good. Okay. I'll kick us off this week. Michael's volunteered to lead our meeting next week, but I can sort of drive the meeting for today. But at this point, I'm just going to get us going. But please, anyone, feel free to jump in, and if you want to share your screen, let me know. All right, so I guess the first thing I'll do is look at the most recent forecast verification, and that is from August 27th, or the forecast that was issued from August 27th, and that verified for September 11th to September 15th. So I know Zach just posted this on Twitter, some of this information. In general, as I look at this, it was all these, the CRPS, our continuous rank probability scores, are benchmarked to the 30-year normal. And as Zach mentioned, almost all the forecasts did well, with, of course, the exception, it seems like we say this every week, of the CFS. The CFS was far too cold, well below the 30-year normal, and was penalized significantly for that. But most inputs did well, and probably highlight Philip, our graduate student here at Rutgers, who did exceptionally well. The normal 10-year, I feel like a broken record with this one. I'm getting sick of saying this. I posted this on Twitter also, but consistently good. And overall, it's been, I think, the best performer for any inputs that participated like 75% of the time. The 10-year is done remarkably, or very well anyway, this summer. And then closely followed by Professor Decker and Zach. Zach deserves a mention here too, as you'll see in a second. I think in terms of forecasts, he's forecast a little less than most folks. I think his sample size is about 8, but he's done very well in those 8 forecasts. We had Mark Russo here also from Rispulse during this input, and they did fairly well also. And then there's our industry participant just below that. So anyway, that's a look at the most recent verification. Again, jump in if you'd like. I'm just going to switch over to the 30-day here real quick. It's a 30-day performance now, sorted. And you can see that Philip is near the top, although there's only 2 forecasts. And then just below Philip, you've got the 10-year normal, which has, there's 5 forecasts. And in terms of human forecasters, you've got Zach. That's Zach right below there. As I mentioned, he's done very well. In particular, since he just started making these subseasonal forecasts. I'm sort of embarrassed here. I've only been doing this for 15 plus years. He's been doing it for 5 minutes. But there's our list of the 30-day. I'm just trying to see, you can again see the ECMWF and CFS below the 30-year. And I'm just going to show one other thing here, and then I'm going to see if there's any questions. Here's the cooling season. So this starts let me click on that again. Sometimes there's a little bit of a delay here with our connection. There we go. So this includes all forecasts issued since May. So you can see the counts over here in the count column. And in terms of, again, forecasts, inputs that have been there at least 50% of the time or so, the normal 10-year is the best. There's Zach and Professor Decker closely behind. And then you can see the ECMWF and the CFS far behind. And again, we should mention, I know she would bring this up if I didn't, these are not bias corrected ECMWF and CFS inputs. So presumably in particular with the CFS, because it has been so reliably bad and cold, you can see the bias here. The bias is over 10 CDDs. I mean, think about what a standard deviation is most week. It's like a 7 or 6, 7, 8 CDD. So that's tremendous. So clearly a CFS bias correction would perform better than this. But that being said, this is the raw guidance, and it's not been very good, at least as compared to the 30-year normal. I don't know.
CFS, even bias corrected, probably isn't very good.
Yeah, hopefully it's better, right? But yes. And by the way, I should mention that one of our participants here, Michael Gruen, he is working on testing a bias correction, initially with the ECMWF, but then perhaps also with the CFS. And some of the initial results with the ECMWF are at least a little bit promising, that, to get a little bit of improvement. But the problem with the ECMWF, and I say problem in quotes, the bias hasn't been reliable, right? So the ECMWF hasn't been that good, but it's been not that good on both sides of things. There's been some cold forecasts that haven't worked well. There have been some warm forecasts that haven't worked well. Whereas with CFS, at least, it's just always or almost always too cold.
Well, is it just a matter of magnitude? Is it like the CFS is always 10 CDDs or thereabouts too cold, so the range for the CFS is something like 5 to 15 too cold, whereas the range for the Euro might be like 2 CDDs too hot to 5 CDDs too cold, or something like that. Like the CFS could still be less reliable. It just has such a massive bias that it's always on one side.
So I can kind of answer the question about the Euro. I did calculate the error for the Euro, and it starting on May 7th through the most recent verification, which is August 27th, its error has ranged from 15 CDDs too cold to 10 CDDs too warm. So it's been kind of all over the place. Now those are, it's usually too cold. But there have been times where it's been too warm as well.
Yeah, but I think if you look at the CFS variability, it's probably going to be comparable to even more. I'm guessing. I'm not speaking based on any data, but this is just my wild guess based on my prior to that, the CFS. And it doesn't surprise me that the Euro sort of missed in both directions over the summer, because the summer was one of those summers that didn't really have a persistent dominating weather regime. So you had the 11 to 15 continually blow up all summer. So the 16 to 20 obviously would be worse than that.
Yeah, definitely. Right. That makes total sense, that if there's not skill in 11 to 15, there's not going to be much skill in the 16 to 20. It would just probably be noise or just luck if there was, especially since we're using the same size window. Something else I forgot to mention, I'm going to go back to the A27, and she, if you have any thoughts on this, I'd love your thoughts or comments. This was a special week too, in the sense that the verification, I had to double check this, was so far outside of our envelope. You can see the warmest forecast, and that I'm including all the numerical guidance inputs and statistical inputs and human inputs here. The warmest forecast was 36.5 CDDs. It verified 48.7 CDDs. I'd have to look back, but this could be one of the bigger, I don't know if bust is the right word, but one of the biggest differences from where the verification was to where the forecast envelope was. I mean, I've seen verifications that have been a couple CDDs or HDDs outside of our envelope, but this is 12 CDDs outside of our forecast envelope. Me or anyone here really does, and I don't have an answer. Does anyone have any thoughts as to why this forecast verified so much hotter than a lot of us expected?
Because global warming exists only in September. Like September, if you look at the past few years, and I'm saying this in a half joking way, of course, but September has been the month that never ever disappoints.
True. That's
like what
I've seen that too from my experience. Yeah, go ahead.
Like assuming there's no radical shift in the next 2 weeks, then the top 4 hottest Septembers will be 2015, 2016, 2018, and 2019. And 2017's September had a cool first half, but its second half September was the hottest ever for that period. So September just doesn't fail.
And are you can see my screen, right?
No, I'm just on a cell phone. I don't know how to deal with all of this.
Okay.
Fancy meetings stuff, but I can reasonably have an idea of what you're showing.
Okay, and I was just going to say that I'm showing the Maxar Dynacast page right now, so it shows what you're saying. The current forecast for September from Maxar would be, if it doesn't change, it's going to be the hottest on record, or at least since 1950, at 250 CDDs, about 10 CDDs higher than the next highest, which is, as she mentioned, 2018, and then 2015, 2016. You have to go to the next one, 1998, to finally find something that's outside of the last few years. So yeah, September has been reliably hot, I guess you could say. Any other, I don't know, anything else though with, I guess, respect to the pattern that you witnessed that the models, I don't know, just did not resolve well? I mean, was it just an intensity kind of thing where the models had the pattern, but it just came in much stronger, or something else?
Well, that's a little bit hard to say, because one of the more unusual things about how this September transpired was that it was a large change from the forecast, but it wasn't really one or two forecasts where it suddenly changed. It was more like you had an entire week of Euro cycles where every cycle would add 2 or 3 CDDs or something like that. So that makes it a little bit harder to diagnose what actually changed. It wasn't like one of those things where it breaks in 1 or 2 model cycles.
Right. Okay. And I also, right now, I've got on the screen, this is the September 11th through September 15th verification, and you can see, this is something Dr. Decker also mentioned last week, but in particular, the southern half of the country and the southeastern half of the country, extremely, very warm, anomalously warm. The northern tier, like Maine and Minnesota, was actually kind of, slightly cool, but especially in September, those areas don't really factor into CDDs as much because the normal temperatures are already, coming down, and there's also not a lot of population up there. I don't know, any other thoughts in terms of attribution before we turn the page to today's forecast?
I don't know if this really counts as attribution, but I remember that this week the CPC forecast was actually, I think it was fairly warm with a lot of red on their map, and I don't remember exactly like what it gave the reason for it being. But I remember this week in particular, I remember looking at it and thinking that was way too warm, which is why I only gave 5% for the CPC this week, that particular week. So I don't remember. I don't know if there's like an archive of CPC forecasts, but that might be, if there is, that might be interesting to look at because I think they were onto something with the warmth.
Yeah, that's a good point. And maybe that's something we can look into. It might even be interesting to, I know like Professor Decker puts in 100% CPC, but it would be interesting to include their technical discussion as part of the contest, just so we can more easily look back and maybe under the strategy statement or something. Maybe we can even ask them to include it, or anyone who references the CPC. It would be great if we could somehow calculate a number from the CPC forecast. We could do it ourselves. We could just have the CPC input, but otherwise it's sort of just subjective, because all we have is the map.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it's something to think about. All right. Just looking back, anything else here? All right, so why don't we shift over to today's 16 to 28 forecast. So I just clicked on, for Xi, I clicked on the 917 tab. So we're looking at everyone's forecast from today. Oh, I should mention that we had Paul Roundy, Professor Roundy at Albany, made a special contribution for this week. He cut a video, a map discussion video, and that he allowed us to utilize for the forecast contest. If you haven't seen it, we posted it on our Twitter feed, and it's also in our tools tab up here. You can find it under tips and tricks. And he published a forecast, and there's an important caveat here that he could only publish his forecast on Friday. So he's kind of at a disadvantage since it's really more like a 20 to 25 day forecast or whatever. But in order to stay consistent with our target window, he volunteered to do that. So just keep that in mind. So he's got a little bit of a disadvantage against us, but his numbers are in here too. All right, so why don't we go through our normal bit here, and I don't know, Michael, would you like to kick us off in terms of your rationale for today's forecast?
Sure. So I went with my usual formula of 50% teleconnections, 30% CPC, 20% the 10-year. So when I looked at the teleconnections, they all seem to be around the positive area. Something I noticed that was interesting about the P&A was that it was consistently, at least for the past 2 weeks, has been consistently verifying near the top end of the ensembles. If you take a look on the teleconnections page from the CPC, you can see that. So I kind of operated under the assumption that it'll be on the warmer side, kind of agreeing with the CPC forecast for that week, showing a lot of warmth in the west, the south, a little bit of below normal in the northern tiers, but that doesn't really affect CDD production. And so I went with slightly above the 10-year. I do think it has the potential to be warmer than that because, especially with what happened with the previous verification, I'm a little suspicious that it might be warmer, but I'm going to go with slightly above the 10-year, so 18.6 was my forecast.
Yeah, Mike, interesting that what you brought up about, referencing this most recent forecast or verification. One other thing that could be helpful to think about in terms of process, and I say could be, it may or may not be, but one of the things I sometimes look at is I'll look at like Radiance and the ECMWF, GFS, the 1 to 5, 6, 10, 11 to 15 day CDD forecast as compared to the 10-year. In other words, how much are we above the 10-year during those periods? Because if I think, for example, that the 16 to 20 is going to be approximately the same, let's say my expectation is the patterns are going to be almost identical. It can sometimes help in terms of magnitude. And let me just give you an example. So I'm looking at the EC Ensemble. Down here, they give you the 6 to 10, and the EC 6 to 10 is 38 CDDs. And let me just make sure I'm at the 10-year. Yep, you can look at 10-year or 30-year here. So I'm looking at the 10-year. So I'm going to go back down. So I know that the EC and Radiance, pretty close to that too, is approximately 11 CDDs above the 10-year in the 6 to 10. And if I look at the 11 to 15, they're approximately, about 8 CDDs or so, at least the ECMWF is. So again, if I feel like it's likely to carry forward, that could also be a benchmark that may be a benchmark to consider, in terms of thinking about what the magnitude of the warmth is going to be in the 16 to 20.
Yeah, that's something I'll look into in the future.
Okay. Want to hit it?
Yeah, sure. So I got my formula statement pretty similar for the last couple of weeks. I mean, as Dave was pointing out, it's been working so far.
Why change it?
Yeah, I don't see any reason to change it. So again, after this recent forecast verification, the trend forecast and the 10-year normal continue to do pretty well. So I continue to factor those two inputs in. But looking at the CPC map, there was a region of colder than normal and potentially just normal temperatures across the upper Northeast, where a lot of those major population centers are. But there was still a pretty consistent warm pattern over the rest of the U.S., so all the forecast inputs were showing warmer than the 30-year. I agreed with it, but I didn't want to go as high as the 10-year and the trend forecast did because of that cold signal. So I went a little bit lower. I think I chose the value of like 17 and a half. A little bit lower than I think it was like 18.4 with the 10 years. So I went a little bit lower, 17 and a half with normal confidence.
That's interesting. Just to dive into that, it's interesting. So you're going, sorry if I'm making you repeat yourself, but so you're bucking the trend a little bit, right? In the sense that, so the recent verification came in a lot warmer, right? And, looking at the next 15 days, it still looks, the models, at least in the 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15 are pretty hot, right? We just looked at that. But you're fading a little bit on the cooler side of the 10-year in the 16 to 20, as opposed to either going right with the 10-year or even going a little bit above that. So what was that rationale again? The concerns about
the cold signal in the CPC was lowering my confidence a bit, and I also know that we're approaching one of those transition periods. So just a little, I'm erring on the side of caution.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Let's see. I know there are a few other folks submitted forecasts, but I'm not sure they're on the line. Luke, I don't think you're on the line. Christine, anyone else on the line here who, before we get to who wants to share their forecast rationale? No? Okay, I can quickly go through mine. Where am I? I'm input number 1 here. So my rationale or my formula and whatnot was pretty similar. It was similar to the previous week. So you can see my formula here. I've got 50% normal 10-year, 25% trend, 10% EC, 15% top 10 hottest. So again, the quick thing there is the normal 10-year, it's been reliably good. So over the last few weeks, I've been generally putting more weight on that. I put weight on our sort of hackish trend forecast that we created. I'm still putting a little bit of weight on the ECMWF. It's somewhat arbitrary or subjective. I don't know if it should be 0 or 20, but because I haven't vetted that out with that kind of objective scheme, but it seems to me it should be pretty low. The CFS I continue to put 0 weight on because of everything we've talked about. this sort of hackish thing, I have also the top 10 hottest. This kind of gets a little bit to what she and I were talking about earlier. I'm trying to factor in something that deals with climate change, the idea that, the normal 10-year, I think, is good, but I think the reality is, right, that climate change is likely that next year and the year after, the next forecast and so on, is likely to be hotter in the average than what we've experienced in the last 10 years. Climate change is not done, in other words. So that's my sort of hackish way to account for something that's even beyond the normal 10-year. Again, I haven't back tested it, but I'm not putting a lot of weight on it, but just a little bit. Other than that, just in terms of some more also just sort of pattern takeaways, I certainly did look at the MJO and things like that, and the MJO's initialized, I think, fairly strong in sort of kind of coming into phase 8, 7, 8. And it's, according to the ESMWF, supposed to remain a relatively moderate to strong signal over the next couple of weeks as it kind of moves from 8 to 1. But the bottom line was two things. It's during the transition seasons, which we're in, kind of September, October, I think it's really hard to interpret the kind of influence these things are going to have because, as we know, the MJO pattern relationship evolves as you go from summer to winter. So that was one limiting factor. And two, I just think there's this overall question, which we've talked about since the beginning of this contest, which we all deal with, she deals with. What influence is the MJO having that is going beyond what the models are already sort of accounting for? And so that all equated to me just not shifting my forecast as a function of the MJO. I have a couple open questions that have been there, and that I think some of them we've already kind of discussed. So that's it for me. We can kind of turn it over to you. And, if you have a ballpark number, that's great. But if not, just, sort of your thoughts on the forecast would be great.
Yeah, so I was thinking something like 20 CDDs with the normal roughly 7 standard deviation for the period. And my thought on that is, so if you take the smoothed out 10-year normal, it's 18.4. It's slightly different from the straight 10-year normal where you just sum up the last 10 years and average them, because especially for these smaller time periods, I feel like, well, not even I feel like, but it is the case that incidentally you're just going to have a lot of noise in what goes into the average. I'm looking at your sheet right now, and the straight 10-year average is actually lower than the straight 30-year average for this period by a little bit, which if you just take the straight average, obviously that's what the numbers say, but that doesn't really make any practical sense. It's probably just an artifact of certain years, like 2010 being unusually low, 2011, despite the rest of that going into that winter being extremely warm. 2011 just incidentally had a very low count for that time of year. 2015 had the same thing where the following winter was super warm, but it just incidentally had a low CDD count. So I would regard normal as closer to 18.5 rather than 16.5. And I'm shading a little bit higher. I'm not going very warm, because in part because the longer term modeling hasn't been too reliable. It's a transition period that often is hard to handle, and it seems like, for instance, the Euro ensemble 16 through 20 is in some sense not really independent information right now. It's sort of just stretching out the 11 through 15, and that could just be some timing averaging. At the same time, I do think it's prudent based on what we're seeing right now to be a little bit higher than the 10-year average just on a risk-weighted basis, because for a lot of that very heavily populated area, roughly going from Chicago to Philadelphia to New York, what you're forecasting is right on the precipice of that region adding CDDs. It's not quite warm enough right now, so for in the forecast numbers you see, like for the Radiant 16 through 20 forecast, those regions mostly are just below getting CDDs. So if the forecast verifies a little bit cooler, you're not removing CDDs from those regions because there's not really many CDDs there to begin with. But if you go a little bit warmer, then those heavily populated areas start adding up technical CDDs very quickly. So just on like a risk-weighted average would suggest, based on what you're looking at, it's probably prudent to, from an error minimization standpoint, to shade a little bit higher, which is why I'm a little bit higher at 20.
Yeah, that's I like that. That's a really interesting way to think about the risk, which is something that we talk about a lot in terms of how to assess risk, and it's always a difficult thing. But I like that argument. I think it seems very logical, and the sense that the risk, right, might be skewed to the higher end again, because if we do shave a little bit of coolness or get a little bit cooler across the north, the downside is not much, because you just CDDs flatten to zero, right? You can't have negative CDDs. But on the other hand, if it goes up a little bit, it could be a lot hotter. That's interesting.
Yeah, and right now, obviously, you can always have some little trough start phasing when you come when that rolls in further in the forecast. But right now, there's not really. Yeah, I don't think a substantial cooler camp within the forecast. It's just a pretty solid trough ridge sort of pattern. So I think the other sort of extremal possibility, which is you get so cool that you start eliminating the CDDs from the south, from places like Florida, is not a particular concern right now.
Right. That would be a pretty severe error in the models, which could happen, but it's
it obviously could happen, but given what it generally looks like right now, given that the tropical forcing is progressing through around 7-8 right now, and 8-1 at this time of year is reasonably accordant with ridging over the east. I think it's not an unreasonable model forecast.
Okay, let me ask you one other question related to some of the things we've talked about. I did notice, I'm going to pull it up on our screen, I think it's 6 to 10. Let me just double check. Yeah, the 6 to 10. I'm sure you've seen this. The differences between the EC ensemble and the GFS ensemble are fairly significant across key areas. Right, the GFS ensemble kind of drives more of a trough into some of the key areas of the eastern consuming region, whereas the EC ensemble kind of sticks more to the pattern, keeping more of the cool and stuff bottled up in Canada in the west, with the ridge in the east. Do you have any comments on those differences in terms of which model's more likely to be correct and why?
Well, that's definitely one of the sort of interesting things of late where you've had the GFS pretty much sustainably different from the euro ever since Saturday. And it's been a large number of cycles where these two models have sustained these differences, and part of it is what a big chunk of it is what you're saying, where the GFS has some kind of big trough phasing event in the 6 through 10 that the euro doesn't. And yesterday it got even more different, where the GFS phased it more and the euro phased it less in the same model cycle. In general, I think that most observers seem to be more in the euro camp, where they're sort of basing their solutions mostly on what the euro says, and not really factoring the GFS very much into their forecast. So, for instance, if you compare the Radiant forecast or Maxar or whatever they call themselves now to the models, they're pretty in line with the euro forecast, and they're seemingly not really taking the GFS into account at all. I think for the purposes of the 16 through 20, it's not really that much of an issue, because towards the end of the GFS run, it starts showing ridging coming back over the East Coast, sort of not quite at the intensity of the euro, but to a similar sort of general, like where the ridging and troughing is sort of pattern. If you look at like the 360-hour height between the GFS and the euro, it's quite similar. So even if they handle the days 6 through 10 and phasing situation differently, and even if that ends up being, even if the GFS ends up being right, that it phases, which sometimes over the summer, the GFS has been right in its willingness to phase more than the euro does, and faster. I don't necessarily think that has major implications to the 16 through 20. And at the same time, the GFS has a tendency to, I think, to like to phase troughs more than the euro does, which sometimes is right and sometimes is wrong. For the 16 through 20, I'm agnostic with respect to it. For the purposes of thinking about like 6 through 10 within the 15-day forecast, I think most people are pretty much accepting the euro and not really making very much of the GFS.
That's good. That's helpful. I thought one of the points you made, just to highlight, was, even if the GFS is right about the 6 to 10, it still comes back to mostly the same pattern as the EC by the end of the 11 to 15, i.e. that it's not, the GFS is not currently showing a long duration kind of change or flip. It's just showing more of a synoptic level of it. All right. I know we have up to 10 minutes left. This is usually where we do any topics of the day, anything, it could be whatever anyone thinks is a hot topic for today that we want to dive into, something relevant to an EC model, a forecast, talk about the MJO, angular momentum, whatever. Anyone have any particular topics that they want to discuss today?
Just one thing I noticed, it's not really a big thing, but the 16 to 20 day forecast from Radiant essentially looks like they just kind of took the Euro 500 millibar pattern that you were showing earlier and just kind of switched it to temperatures, and that's kind of their forecast. I don't think that's what they ended up doing, but it seems kind of close. There's just something interesting.
Well, I've got it on the screen here, Mike. Yeah, you can certainly. I mean, just from a temperature perspective, their map looks very close. I mean, their map looks very close to the map, right? I mean, it's not too much different. The pattern's the same. The intensity, it's a little hard to say because the scales are different. But yeah, it does look. In this case, I think we've seen this, right? And it's not fair. I know Radiant's not on the call right now. Their actual, we're looking at here that the ECMWF mean or median is actually important. The median number is 21.5. The Radiant forecast is closer to 17. So they are not as warm as the ECMWF, but it definitely does. I think overall, right? It seems like they're typically in the ballpark of the ECMWF, which, by the way, is not necessarily this historically. That's not that's not necessarily a bad place to be, right? I mean, I think the ECMWF has a good reputation and is the best numerical guidance, and so I think it would make sense that a lot of folks, myself included, would tend to follow the ECMWF or some sort of bias-corrected ECMWF. But of course, the summer, for what it's worth, right? And this summer, right? Two things, right? Obviously, from a CDD perspective, has not performed well. But one thing that we still haven't really dug into, and maybe this is another question for Shi, I'll put you on the spot again. We know it hasn't performed that well, as at least benchmarked to the 30-year normal. But from a more like a jet stream level, 500 millibar level, does it seem like it's doing better there, i.e. that it's generally capturing the pattern at the upper levels and it's just not being reflected well at the surface? Or is it a case where whether it's the surface or the upper levels, it's just not doing that well? Shi, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a combination of things. It's over the summer, it was in a lot of it seemed to just be some sort of surface temperature bias, where I'm not really that familiar with how the pattern verifications have been. I think if you look at the Radiant verification method for the Euro, which is just a correlation method, so if it's consistently biased, it can still have a high correlation. The North American 2-meter temperatures for the Euro have been pretty steady over the past month and a half for the 11 through 15, whereas the heights for the Northern Hemisphere have sometimes had some big dropouts. So I guess the short answer is I don't really know. Off the top of my head, I think a good chunk of it is surface temperature bias. I'm not sure whether the pattern forecasting is any better or worse than it usually is.
Fair enough. Let's see, we just have a couple minutes left. Hey, Shi, I'm gonna put you on the spot one more time because again, we're kind of lucky to have you here. Um, Zach, sitting next to me, amongst other things, is also investigating the relationship between MGO and sort of system, in model error, numerical model guidance errors, in particular, see if we can identify systematic errors relating MJO to either the ECMWF or the CFS. Do you have any advice based on your experience, your knowledge? Do you have any advice for Zach in terms of what to look at, where to look, what to look for? I don't know, anything like that?
Well, there's one piece of folk wisdom that's around, which is when the MJO is initialized in phases 4 and 5, the Euro often struggles to get to progress it past phases 4 and 5. And I've seen knowledgeable people, like not just your random Joe Bastardes or whatever, but knowledgeable people talk about how sometimes initialization in phases 4 and 5 is one of the few times that they would trust the GFS over the Euro. So that piece of folk wisdom seems like a natural point to look. Like, are Euro errors higher than normal, and is there an unusual bias that it exhibits when it initializes in phases 4 and 5 as opposed to anywhere else on that diagram? And the other piece of folk wisdom, which is probably better known and probably it's known enough that there probably is literature on it to some extent, is the GFS loves phases 8 and 1, and that's something that's been known. I think that's actually just folk wisdom, where I have no idea who first noticed it, and I have no idea where that impression comes from, but it's just something that everyone's who follows the weather sort of subconsciously knows is a thing. And just looking at the GFS tendency, whether it actually does tend toward phases 8 and 1, whether that disproportionately impacts its behavior, especially in winter when 8 and 1 are the super cold phases, is looking at that. So I'd go with the Euro 4 or 5 biases first, just because that's a little bit more original and probably a little bit more useful, in the sense that it's rare to find systematic biases in the Euro. But obviously the GFS 8-1 is always kind of a good exercise, just to see if you're finding something similar, if your discovery, if your methodology helps you discover like something that is sort of known to be a thing, and just check to see whether you're doing it in the right way. I think the Euro 4-5 probably is a good exercise to go after.
All right, great.
Cool. Thanks, G.
We'll keep you in the loop on that. We get some results. All right. Anything else before we close it out? All right, Shi, this was great. This really was. I think we covered a lot, so appreciate you making a return visit, and hopefully we can do it again soon.
All right. Well, I guess to most of you, I don't know how many of you have met me before. Those who haven't met me, you can just consider me some disembodied voice from the phone, but I hope to eventually meet you sometime. And so thanks for having me, and I hope this has been interesting and not and that it's I thought it was a decent discussion.
Yeah, it's been great. Yeah, we'll definitely try to have you down here next time. So, all right. Well, thanks, Sheehan. Thanks for everyone here for participating. We'll see you next week. Bye, guys.
Yep. See you.
All right, bye everyone.